Louisville was lost. 5 days ago, a parasite was released into the city. It spread uncontrollably and mutated the residents into horrifying creatures. Only 24 hours before the outbreak, there was an anonymous phone call to authorities from the research lab inside the city, alerting them of the breach. Quickly, a specialized military biohazard response team was given command of the operation and quarantined Louisville entirely. For 5 days, the city has been in the dark. All communications from emergency services have gone quiet. The military has been given authorization to neutralize the parasite and level the city with firepower. Then, a distress call came from the lab inside the city. There were 3 doctors still alive that needed emergency extraction. They had knowledge of the origin and nature of the parasite and were top priority for rescue. The plan was to enter the city in armored vehicles through the main gate, locate the lab and secure it, then extract the doctors and retreat out of the east gate. There would be 2 teams, one to secure the exit of the lab and one to enter and make contact with the doctors. Sargent Loyde Decker was in command of the operation. A seasoned veteran of the biohazard response team, he was given this mission because him and his team were the best of the best. Stationed outside the city at the main gates, they prepared for what awaited them, then loaded into the armored trucks and entered the quarantine zone. An air extraction would be far too loud. They had to try to do this as quietly as possible to not attract hordes of the infected. The place was a wasteland. Crashed cars and burned out buildings everywhere. The infected would throw themselves in front of the vehicles trying to slow them down. Then suddenly, the second truck exploded, causing it to crash into a building. The infected began to close in on it and surround it. The lead truck attempted to turn around and help the others from the crash, but as they were turning the truck, it suddenly exploded as well. The sergeant quickly jumped out of the truck and began laying down fire. The infected swarmed the area, and the sergeant got split up from his team, getting pushed further and further away from the trucks. His gunfire was attracting more and more of the infected, and he was becoming surrounded. His team was now completely out of sight and likely dead. He was now on his own. Getting low on ammunition, he was forced to retreat into a building. The sergeant was pinned down and completely surrounded. He had nowhere to run or hide. He took cover in a room, while the infected pounded on the door. Then the door blew off its frame. The sergeant readied his rifle and waited. Nothing came through the door. Everything went quiet. A man entered the room. He was wearing a clean, fine pressed suit, was completely bald, and had an unsettling smile. In his hand was a briefcase. He approached the sergeant while maintaining eye contact. Then the sergeant heard a voice in his head. It was a whispered voice that repeated, "Follow me." The sergeant cautiously followed the man. He was just about to be ripped apart by the infected, so any lifeline to get out of the situation was welcomed. The man led the sergeant to another room which from the outside looked to be a broom closet, but when they entered it, were in a storefront that was for sale. They walked outside and across the street, then reached the lab. They entered the building and went to one of the upper floors. The suited man led him to a door. Then he heard the man's voice in his head again saying, "This way, this way." The room smelled terrible and was filled with blood and corpses. The sergeant checked the bodies. Then the doctor came in. His head was swollen up with large growths all over it, and he was clearly infected. He introduced himself as Dr. Charles Montgomery, lead researcher at Finnegan. He told the sergeant that just over a week ago, a briefcase was left in his office. Inside of it was a vial containing a strange parasitic creature. While he was studying it, somehow it managed to escape from its container and infect him. Then it quickly duplicated itself and spread through his lab. One of the researchers was able to call in the outbreak to the military before she was infected, and that is when they quarantined the area. Then out of nowhere, the doctor pulled out a gun and shot the sergeant right in the guts. He fell to the floor, bleeding badly. Everything went dark. The sergeant woke up laying in the street. His wounds and weapons were gone. He stood up and looked around. He was right near the main military blockade. None of it made any sense, but he was out. He approached the gates and gave the passcode. Then he was let inside. During debriefing, there wasn't much to say. The whole team was lost, and the doctor was infected already. The mission was a failure. The sergeant returned to his tent. His thoughts were spinning. Then his head suddenly began to throb with immense pain. He fell to the ground and could feel something moving around inside his brain. He was infected. The parasite was inside him, and he had brought it past the firing lines. The realization came too late, however, and the sergeant was beginning to change. Then he emerged from the tent, completely transformed into a monstrous beast. Immediately, he tore through the military checkpoint, killing everyone he saw and destroying the power grid. Then he destroyed the heavy weapons, completely crippling the defensive line. This was the plan all along, and why the doctor called the rescue. They needed him to destroy the defenses from inside, so that the parasite could get past it. Now, with the defenses down, the army of infected poured out of the city and straight toward the checkpoint. The military no longer had the firepower to deal with this size of an attack, and was quickly defeated, tearing into them and spreading the parasite. It was horrifying. Once the horde made its way through the base, it breached the quarantine and spread outside the city, and was now headed straight for the city of West Point. The citizens had absolutely no idea what was heading their way, but they would soon find out. Thank you kindly for watching. Your likes, comments, and subscriptions mean the absolute world to the sergeant and I. Cheers.